This is Turnham Green Station in West London. It's on the London Underground District line. Sometimes it is on the Piccadilly line, but mostly it isn't. Let's take a dive into the history of this apparently inconsistent station. When Turnham Green opened on the 1st of January 1869, it wasn't technically on the District line at all. And it definitely wasn't on the Piccadilly line. It wasn't even an underground station. It was actually opened by the London and South Western Railway, the company that ran trains from Waterloo down to the south coast and into the West Country. But the LSWR were also very savvy towards the growing market for commuter trains. London was growing, and railways were both the cause of this and a response to it. The LSWR had a line through Richmond. By the middle of the 1860s, they decided that they wanted to branch out in a very literal sense. Their plan was to build a line from Richmond through Kew, over the river to Brentford, through Chiswick, Hammersmith and Shepherd's Bush, finally terminating at Addison Road, the station you and I would know as Kensington Olympia. Addison Road was on the West London line, which at the time was a key connecting route between several different railways. Parliamentary approval was received in 1867, and it took less than 2 years for the line to be completed. Turnham Green was one of the stations the LSWR proposed to build. Ironically, Turnham Green is not the closest station to the actual Turnham Green. That would be Chiswick Park, but that station wouldn't come along until later. I wouldn't be surprised if the company chose the name simply because it sounds nice, like the sort of place where you might buy a little cottage and commute from by train. The station back then was rather different. There were only 2 tracks, and the platforms were considerably lower. Carriages in those days were fitted with footboards so passengers could step down, concepts like accessibility and level boarding no doubt being seen as weak and effeminate. So the LSWR began running trains over the new line. The following year, the Great Western Railway began running a service from Paddington to Richmond over this line. Later that year, they stopped. In 1874, the Metropolitan District Railway reached Hammersmith. The original point of the District Railway was to build a line from Kensington to Tower Hill, giving the Metropolitan Railway a circular route, or circle line if you prefer. They quickly became sidetracked, so to speak, by building lines out into the West London suburbs. These lines were relatively cheap to build and opened up new markets. The district was a rather impecunious organisation, which I mention partly to explain why they might go for the cheaper option first, and partly because I like the word impecunious. At Hammersmith, the LSWR and the district were pretty close together. Now, if there was one thing the district liked more than a cheap branch line in the suburbs, it was being able to use someone else's branch in the suburbs. So in 1877, a connection was built between Hammersmith on the district and Shaftesbury Road on the LSWR, a station you and I know as Ravenscourt Park. This enabled a district service to Richmond, and for the first time, Turnham Green was served by underground trains, even though the term underground wasn't official back then. The Metropolitan Railway also negotiated rights to run over this route. Remember I mentioned that the platforms were low at Turnham Green? Well, that was about to become a problem. The district's platforms were about 1.5 feet higher than those on the LSWR, and their coaches were designed accordingly. This meant that passengers alighting at LSWR stations had a large gap between the footboards and the actual platform. The footboards were also quite narrow, only 2 inches further out than the carriage body. These factors combined in 1878 to result in a passenger at Turnham Green falling under a train, leading to their death. This led the LSWR to increase the height of their platforms to a sort of compromise height between their own preference and that of the district. Also in 1878, the Midland Railway began running services from St Pancras. This lasted until 1880. All of these services kind of illustrate how complicated the rail network in Victorian London was. There were all kinds of services that we just don't have anymore. relying on lots of unexpected connections and negotiations between companies. In the 1870s and 80s, a new development appeared by the station. This was Bedford Park Garden Suburb. This was the brainchild of Thomas Carr, and was intended as a new suburb for middle-class residents. Chelsea had been the go-to destination for creative types, but in recent years it had become too expensive for them. Which just goes to show that the patterns of gentrification that people complain about now are nothing new. Anyway, Carr envisaged a pleasant suburb designed with plenty of greenery and William Morris-inspired arts and crafts style architecture. Turnham Green Station was a key part of this, as it would enable residents to work in central London. The full history of Bedford Park is outside the scope of this video, but it was the first of the garden suburbs, and would influence many others that followed. This would lead to the Garden City movement in the late 19th century, but would also act as basically the model for suburbs all the way up to the present day. In 1879, another branch line opened. The District Railway decided that they were going to serve Ealing. The Great Western Railway already had a station at Ealing Broadway, but they really didn't seem that interested in providing a decent service. If they didn't want those passengers, the District Railway certainly did. The line to reach Ealing would come off the LSWR's line just west of Turnham Green and was to be wholly owned by the district. This seems like a bit of a gamble. If things had gone wrong between the district and the LSWR, the line to Ealing Broadway would have been isolated from the rest of the company's lines. I'm also surprised the district didn't ask the LSWR if they'd like to come in on it, since the LSWR were the Great Western Railway's biggest rival. In 1880, the district received authorization for yet another line which opened in 1883. This one would serve Hounslow, branching off the Ealing branch just before Ealing Common. This would become pretty important to Turnham Green later in our story. In 1894, the Great Western started serving Turnham Green again, this time going via the Metropolitan Railway's route. In 1901, the District Railway was bought out by Underground Electric Railways of London, a voracious organisation that would end up controlling the lion's share of transport in London, and was essentially the predecessor of Transport for London. This was the best thing that could have happened to the district, because the people who headed UERL were Charles Yerkes and Edgar Speyer, one an experienced railway promoter, and the other a financial whiz. One of the key investments the new owners wanted to make, in fact their main justification for taking the district over, was electrification. Electric trains and electro-pneumatic signals would take the railway into the 20th century. The line through Turnham Green was a bit of a concern. Electric trains, which accelerated and braked very rapidly and did not need to be turned around at a terminus, offered potential for a far more frequent service than had hitherto been possible. Except the Metropolitan and LSWR were still running steam trains, which was basically guaranteed to mess things up. The district argued in 1903 for a pair of extra tracks that would be purely theirs. The LSWR complained because if the district were using their own tracks, they wouldn't be paying the LSWR. A compromise of sorts was reached. The district would continue using the LSWR track, but they could electrify them and, within reason, run as many trains as they liked over them. This didn't quite work out. Sharing with steam trains just didn't work. Not only were the puffers slower, but they were more prone to delays. The lines also used mechanical signalling, which was not as quick as UERL's preferred electro-pneumatic equipment. It gives you some idea of the district's ambitions that they could run 10 trains an hour through Turnham Green, and they considered this a massive imposition. So in 1909 they devised a plan to once again add an extra set of tracks between Ravenscourt Park and Turnham Green, and this time it was granted. Turnham Green was reconstructed in stages. The street-level buildings remained as they were, but the tracks and platforms were completely rebuilt. Works were completed in 1911. Now the district would use the new outer tracks, and the slow coach railways like the LSWR and the Met would use the middle tracks. The district proudly boasted that they could now offer up to 20 trains an hour. They were also able to operate express trains for the first time, which skipped most of the stations in the suburbs on the journey to Ealing Broadway. This increased the capacity of the line, but soon it would become clear that more was needed. The problem was that not only was the district a busy line, but by the 1920s it was a complicated one, particularly at its western end. From central London one could get a train to Hounslow, Richmond, Wimbledon, Ealing, or, as of 1910, Uxbridge. But because all these destinations needed to be served, the service on each individual branch was not particularly good. Say you have 20 trains an hour, per the district's claim, and there are 5 branches. That means each destination can have 4 trains an hour, if you distribute them evenly. But the district didn't. Hounslow and Uxbridge had a pretty poor service because Ealing and Richmond were perceived as needing a better service. But UERL had a solution. There was another line running into Hammersmith by this point, the Great Northern Piccadilly and Brompton, better known as the Picadilly Tube. This had plenty of spare capacity at its western end, but crucially it was also owned by UERL. So the company devised a plan: electrify the LSWR tracks, double up the tracks between Hammersmith and Ravenscourt Park, and hand the Uxbridge and Hounslow services to the Piccadilly line. Well, most of them at least. The LSWR were happy to play ball, not being particularly interested in that line these days. The Metropolitan had actually stopped running trains in 1906 and the Great Western in 1910. But the Met presented a potential problem. They had been talking about resuming services. But UERL didn't think they were very serious and presented them with a deal whereby the Met would hold off for 20 years. Which was fine, it turned out. In 1921, the Trade Facilities Act was passed. This was a fund that provided affordable loans for public works projects that could help reduce the dreadful unemployment rate at the time. Naturally, UERL jumped on it. However, work didn't actually begin until 1929 and the passing of another financing act, the Development Loan Guarantees and Grants Act, which was basically a more favourable version of the Trade Facilities Act. I guess the government really wanted to get people back to work. In the meantime, the LSWR had ceased to exist. It had become part of the Southern Railway in 1923. The Southern was equally uninterested in running trains over this route, and in 1926 they gave the district full control. Turnham Green was finally a true underground station. In 1930, work began to extend the Piccadilly line to the west. It was also expanding to the east, but that, again, is outside the scope of this video, and I mention it purely for context. Where it operated over the district route, it would serve as an express. Piccadilly trains would skip Ravenscourt Park, Stamford Brook and Chiswick Park. The decision to also skip Turnham Green was only taken in 1931. Previously, the idea was that some trains would terminate there. Works were completed in 1932. In 1933, UERL became part of London Transport, as did the Metropolitan Railway. This created the modern London Underground, which meant that disputes between tube lines were ended and the underground lines had a stronger position in negotiations with other railways. The fact that Piccadilly line trains don't stop at Turnham Green is something of a frustration for London-bound passengers who see the little trains pass tantalisingly close without stopping. It's enough to turn them green with envy. In 1963, London Transport listened to their pleas and added Turnham Green to the Piccadilly line, but only in rush hour. In 1964, staff shortages brought about the end of the district service to Hounslow West, which in any case was rush hour only at this point. In 2013, Transport for London, successors to London Transport, announced an exciting new development for Turnham Green. Namely, that Piccadilly line trains would stop there all day. The introduction of a new, larger fleet and upgraded signalling would allow this by the early 2020s. Unfortunately, that nasty pandemic business happened. TfL suffered a major financial setback, and it's not clear when or even if this upgrade is going to happen. Which brings us to the present day. Turnham Green is best known as where you need to change trains between the Ealing and Richmond branches. Of course, if you've ever travelled west on the District Line, you know that the one service you want is the only one that never comes, no matter where you're trying to get to. It's also famous for being the station that's confusingly listed on the Piccadilly Line, but not always. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this semi-served tale from the Tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like, as always, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your support. You are the outer track to my Tube service. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.